People talked about how unlikely it was for someone like Osita, the boy with the ragged uniform, to compete against students from better off schools. They wondered aloud why he even bothered. Does he know he will embarrass himself? Ifeoma asked her friends as they gossiped and walked home. Maybe he's just desperate for attention, one of the girls said, to Osita's hearing, and they all laughed. Osita paid them no mind. He had faced ridicule his entire life and was used to people doubting him. Osita lived in a mud brick house with his both parents and 4 siblings. His father, Anuku, was a subsistence farmer, while his mother, Nwaka, sold vegetables and fruits at the local market. Life was hard. They only had enough to feed themselves, but little was left for new clothes or school needs. It was difficult for him to own a second school uniform, and so he wore tattered uniforms stained by dirt and sweat to school every day. He went to school every morning happy in his faded uniform and torn noisy sandals. His school was a rundown building with cracked windows and broken desks. Most of the students in the school came from poor backgrounds, but none was as visibly struggling as Osita. Osita's classmates were a mix of indifferent learners and a few bright students, but he consistently topped his class. He had a love for learning that nothing, not even hunger or exhaustion, could dim. In class, Osita solved math problems with ease and read ahead of the curriculum. Despite his intelligence, he was bullied for being poor. Each day after school, while most students returned home to play or do their homework, Osita headed straight to the village market with a tray of bottled water. Amongst other vendors and hawkers shouting over one another to sell their goods was Osita shouting, "Water! Buy water!" He was just 11 years old, but yet worked so hard. The little money he made from selling water was not just for himself. It helped pay his school fees, bought his books, and occasionally contributed to household expenses. Osita returned home late every day, exhausted, and sometimes couldn't wash his school uniform as the sun had long set. In spite of his exhaustion, he managed to light a kerosene lamp, open his books, and start to study. His parents were worried about the stress his after-school business was giving him, but he was unbothered because he believed that education was his only way out of poverty. The village was a small close-knit and everyone knew each other's business. Some of the children in the village began to ridicule Osita. The most vocal among them were a group of girls led by Ifeoma, the daughter of a local trader. She was always dressed in neat, clean clothes and was attending a private school in their community. She and her friends never missed an opportunity to mock Osita whenever they saw him on his way to school. "Look at him, wearing the rag he calls a uniform. It looks like it's been dragged through the mud," Ifeoma said. The other girls giggled, pointing at his patched up shirt. Osita was embarrassed, but he kept walking. He had learned to endure the taunts, even though they stung deeply. It was easier to ignore them than to engage in a pointless argument. He knew they looked down on him because of his circumstances, but he was determined not to let their words define him. The boys in his school were not any kinder. They saw Osita's diligence and intelligence as a threat. Whenever a teacher praised him in class, their anger towards him grew. During break time, they would gather in groups and talk about him. Sometimes they threw insults at him as they walked past. But Osita never reacted. His parents had told him that responding to their provocation would only make things worse. One hot afternoon, during closing assembly, the principal announced that the local government was organizing a spelling bee and mathematics competition for secondary schools in the area. The competition was open to all schools in the local government and the prizes included scholarships, books, and other educational resources. The students were excited about the news. This was the kind of opportunity Osita had been waiting for, a chance to prove himself on a bigger stage. In his excited state, he remembered where he was coming from. He looked down at his worn-out uniform and thought of how people would laugh at him if he showed up looking like a beggar. How could he stand on a stage and compete when he didn't even have a proper uniform? The next day, his class teacher, Mrs. Obi, asked the students who were interested in representing the school to stay behind after class. Osita stepped forward, dragging his feet as he wondered if he would be accepted. He noticed some of the other students giggling, clearly thinking he had no business entering the competition, but Mrs. Obi smiled warmly at him. "I am glad you're interested, Osita," she said. "I know you can do this." After the meeting, as the other students left, Mrs. Obi called Osita aside. "I know you're worried about your uniform," she said gently, "but don't let that stop you. I will see what I can do about that." After a few days, the teacher gave him a neatly folded uniform. It wasn't brand new, but it was clean, ironed, and without any tears. Osita could hardly believe it. He had never worn anything so well kept. With tears in his eyes, he thanked Mrs. Obi. In preparation for the competition, Osita stayed up late into the night studying. He wanted to give his all in the competition, not just for himself, but to show that Mrs. Obi's belief in him was not misplaced. As the competition drew near, he spent every spare moment he had practicing, spelling words and solving math problems. Osita studied long into the night and never stopped even when his old kerosene lamp's light was weak. He went over lists of words, solved equations and recited definitions until they were etched into his memory. Sometimes he got so caught up in his work and fell asleep with his book still open. While he was preparing for the competition, his school and other school children never stopped mocking him. Regardless of their hostility, Osita remained focused, believing that he could really win. The news of the upcoming competition spread throughout the village. Parents, teachers, and students talked about it incessantly, and schools began preparing their best candidates. It was a chance for the winning school to gain recognition and for the students to earn scholarship that could change their lives. For Osita School, the stakes were high. They didn't have the resources or prestige that wealthier schools in the town had, but they had something other schools underestimated. A student like Osita, whose resolve was stronger than his circumstances. In the days leading up to the first round of the competition, schools were excited and skeptical. What they didn't know was that he had something more valuable than fancy clothes or private tutors. He had a heart full of determination and a mind sharpened by hard work. The day of the first competition round finally arrived. It was held at a secondary school in the neighboring village, a slightly larger and better equipped facility than Osita's school. The candidates from different schools arrived in neat uniforms, many of them accompanied by proud parents and guardians. Osita stood alone at the edge of the crowd, with the uniform his teacher had given him. It was the best he had ever looked, and even though his heart pounded with nerves, he felt a surge of pride. As the event began, the students were ushered into a large hall with rows of wooden desks and chairs. Osita took his seat, looking around at other students. Some of them looked confident, while others seemed just as anxious as he felt. The first part of the competition was the spelling bee. Students were called one by one to spell increasingly difficult words. Osita's palms were sweaty as he waited for his turn, silently mouthing the words that were given to other contestants. When it was finally his turn, he stepped forward. "Your word is appetite," the judge announced. Osita took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. He pictured the word in his mind just as he had practiced so many times. Slowly, he began to spell it out, enunciating each letter clearly. When he finished, there was a tense silence in the room. "That is correct," the judge declared. Osita let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He confidently returned to his seat. The first hurdle was cleared, but there was still a long way to go. The competition continued with math problems and more challenging words. One by one, students were eliminated until only a few remained. Osita was still standing. He was in the top 3, a position that many in the audience hadn't expected him to reach. By the end of the day, his school had won the first round and earned a spot in the local level competition. The news spread quickly back in the village. Those who had doubted him began to see that Osita was not just some poor boy with ragged clothes. He was someone smart and with a willpower that wouldn't be broken. When he returned to the village after the first victory, he noticed something different. Some of the boys and girls who used to laugh at him were now talking among themselves and looking at him with expression of surprise. Ifeoma and her friends, who had always ridiculed him, watched him walk with disbelief and envy. They had grown used to seeing him as the poor boy, and now they didn't quite know how to react. Osita noticed the change, but he wasn't concerned with their approval or attention. He knew his focus had to remain on the next stage of the competition. He continued selling water at the market, and in between customers, he mentally reviewed math formulas and silently practiced spelling words. Though people were beginning to show interest in him, Osita never lost focus because he knew others were still determined to see him fail. The children who felt threatened by his growing recognition began to spread rumors that he was cheating and that he got lucky in the first round. The rumors reached Osita, but he chose to ignore them. He had learned to let negativity bounce off him like water on stone. A few of his classmates even approached him to congratulate him. The local level competition was more intense than the first round. It was held in a larger town, and the best students from several schools across the region came together to compete. The stakes were higher and the challenges were tougher. Osita's school traveled to the competition venue in a rickety bus. Mrs. Obi had drilled Osita and other candidates rigorously, and he felt ready for whatever awaited him. The competition was fierce. The math problems were complex, and the spelling words were nearly impossible. But Osita stayed calm and didn't let the pressure get to him, even when some of the other students stumbled and were eliminated. And by the end of the event, it was clear that Osita's school had once again outperformed the others. And Osita had been instrumental in their victory, as he earned the highest scores in both math and spelling. Osita's performance had been nothing short of remarkable, and even those who had initially doubted him couldn't help but acknowledge his brilliance. The win qualified his school to compete at the national level. When Osita returned home, the welcome he received was different. The students who had once bullied him kept their distance and no longer dared to mock him. Osita anxiously prepared for the national level competition. He wasn't doing this just for recognition or prizes. He was doing it for his family, his village, and for every child who had ever been told they weren't good enough because they were poor. The day of the national competition arrived, and Osita, his fellow students, along with Mrs. Obi, boarded a bus to the capital city. Schools from all over the country were represented, their students dressed in immaculate uniforms. Some of them exchanged confident glances, already sizing up their competition. The event kicked off and Osita advanced through the rounds with a great focus. The words grew more complex and the math problems became more intricate, but he was prepared. The audience watched in amazement as he tackled each problem with precision. By the time the final round arrived, only 5 students remained and Osita was one of them. The final round was intense. The remaining students were asked to spell words that most people had never heard of and solve math problems that even adults would find challenging. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and even the judges were impressed by the level of skill on display. When his turn came, he spelled each word with clarity and confidence and approached the difficult math questions methodically. He broke them down into manageable parts and eventually was declared the winner by the judges. Osita could not believe himself. The boy who once walked to school in tattered clothes, who was mocked for his poverty, was now a national champion. The victory changed everything for Osita and his family. The scholarship that came with the win was beyond anything they had ever imagined. It covered not just his secondary education, but also his university studies, all the way to a PhD if he chose to pursue it. This was nothing short of a miracle for a boy who had once struggled to pay his school fees by selling water. A ground ceremony was held as the entire community turned out to welcome him back to the village. With the scholarship funds, he purchased new school uniforms, books, and other essentials. His days of wearing torn and dirty clothes were over, but even as his circumstances improved, he remained humble and never forgot where he came from. Osita excelled in secondary school, went to university, and shone even brighter. Osita graduated with a first class and was immediately accepted into a postgraduate program. His academic journey continued as he earned a master's degree and then a PhD. During his studies, he met Ada, a talented medical laboratory scientist. They got married and were blessed with 3 children, who were as bright and curious as he was. Osita, after some time, became a chief consultant in plastic surgery at a prestigious teaching hospital. He also became a lecturer in the medical college, where he inspired the next generation of doctors. Some of the very people who had mocked him in his youth ended up working under his supervision in the hospital. A farmer and her group, who had once ridiculed him for his poverty, couldn't help but marvel at how far he had come. They saw in him not just the boy they used to know, but a man who had defied the odds through sheer willpower and determination. And some of them regretted the years they had wasted mocking others instead of focusing on their own growth. Life has a way of coming full circle, and Osita's story taught us that our circumstances does not define our potentials. With determination, hard work, and focus, one can rise above any challenge and achieve greatness. No matter where we come from, our dedication and perseverance can lead us to a brighter future. Hello, favorite one. Thanks for listening to my stories. Your support means the world to me, and I couldn't do this without you. Your likes, comments, and shares keep me motivated to create more stories. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the post notification bell so you never miss out on any of my new stories. Thanks again and see you in the next story.